So today's guest on the Keen on Yoga podcast is Nicki Doane. Nicki has a yoga studio in Maui on the North Shore called Maui Yoga Studio. And she has been practicing since 1988. First trip to Mysore is 1991. So welcome, Nicki. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
My pleasure.
Yeah,
Thank
it's
you
lovely
for
to speak
having
to you.
me.
Yeah, especially at this time. So we're going to talk a little bit about Maui and the devastation there in the later part of the podcast. But first of all, before that, on the happier topic, let's talk about your introduction to yoga, Nicki. How did you get into it? And then how did you get into Ashtanga? Because I know you've studied many types of yoga, not just Ashtanga.
I have. Well, to be honest with you, I was kind of a hippie kid. I was really into a band called the Grateful Dead, and which probably tells you a lot about me right there. But that's the first place I ever saw people doing yoga. I grew up living overseas, actually. My dad worked for the Foreign Service, so I was born overseas and spent most of my childhood living in Europe and Eastern Europe and the Middle East. And so fairly conservative, right? My dad worked for the government. So when I got to high school, my mom was very insistent that we live in the US. She wanted me to have some sense of American culture before I went to college. So when I started high school, little did she know. But one of my students, or not one of my students, one of the kids in my journalism class one day I was 15 years old, he handed me a cassette tape of the Grateful Dead. And I had never heard of them. And I listened to it and it blew my mind. I was like, whoa. And then he said, you should come to a concert. They're going to be in Richmond. This was outside of Washington, D.C. And I said, okay. And I went, and again, mind blown. And that's the first place I ever saw people practicing yoga. I didn't know what yoga was. It wasn't a common thing.
Concert.
This was, yes, in the
Right.
parking lot. There was always like a scene, because often they would stay in a city for a few days. And so people would literally camp. It would be like this traveling circus of a scene. And there were all these hippies. Also vegetarianism. I had never heard of vegetarianism. And I was like, oh, what is this? I ended up becoming a vegetarian at 18. Still am. But yeah, I saw people practicing yoga. And so I just equated yoga and vegetarianism with being a hippie and the Grateful Dead, which I thought all of that was super cool. And then when I went to university, which was in Western Massachusetts, at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, they offered yoga for gym credit, and you needed 3 gym credits to graduate. And it was kind of amazing. They actually had 3 different kinds of yoga. They had Hatha yoga, Kundalini yoga, and Iyengar yoga. And I ended up starting with the Hatha yoga, and I'll never forget, I was not a morning person at all. And I had signed up for the class. It was the second semester, so it was January. It was very cold in Massachusetts. And I got my schedule, and it said that the yoga class started at 8 o'clock in the morning. And I remember being like, what? No, I am not getting up at 8 o'clock. And then I was like, well, I really should try it. And then, of course, I look, and the gym where it was like all the way across the campus. And I remember having to set my alarm and thinking, this better be good. And I got up and had to put all my coats on, trudge all the way across the campus. It was snowing. And I got to the class, and again, mind blown. I didn't even know what to expect, but the metaphor that I've always used for that experience is that it felt like I was putting on very well-worn shoes. Or boots, that were broken in perfectly to me. I had never stepped into something that felt so familiar that I had never done before. And it blew my mind. And I remember leaving the class. It was only an hour. Leaving the class, and I had some friends living in a dorm nearby, and I went and knocked on their doors like 9 o'clock in the morning and woke them up. And I was like, I have to tell you about this yoga class. It was incredible. They're like, yeah, can you come back in a couple hours? And I was like, yeah, okay. But I didn't miss a class the whole semester. And yeah, that was it. And then I ended up taking a Kundalini yoga class the next semester, which was at the time a little too, I'll say religious or dogmatic for me at the time. I was 19 years old. The people were really nice. I loved the vibe, but it was like a little bit too much. And then I ended up taking an Iyengar yoga class near the end of university. And the teacher wasn't teaching Iyengar yoga, but had recently met Tim Miller, who, is a very old school Ashtanga teacher. And instead, he taught the entire primary series through the semester. And I, of course, was like, what is this? This is amazing. And then I ended up having an opportunity after I graduated from university, which I thought I was going to Russia. I was going to be a Russian translator. I studied because I lived in Moscow when I was 13, 14 years old. I thought I was moving to Russia. That's what I had studied in university, and the Berlin Wall had just come down a couple years before. It was 1991. There were a lot of job opportunities. And I even went down to Washington, D.C. to the State Department and got tested, and my proficiency was high enough. So I applied for several jobs, only they weren't going to be ready for a few months. So my dad was like, well, just sit tight. And I was like, okay, I'm going to go traveling. And I ended up traveling to the West Coast, ended up in Encinitas, California, Tim Miller's studio. He didn't even have his own studio then. It was called the North Shore Yoga Center in Solana Beach. And anyway, I stayed there for a couple of months, and I like cleaned the studio in exchange for being able to take classes. I was house sitting for people, dog sitting, just trying to make it work. And then I had an opportunity to go to Mysore. Someone offered me an opportunity, and I was like, okay. And I remember calling my parents and like saying, by the way, I'm going to India in a week. And they were like, what? No, you can't. You're these jobs. And I was like, well, they have phones, you can call them. And that was literally back in the day when to make an international call to India, you had to book a call like with an international operator. And it was not easy to get in touch. But I was like, here's the name of the hotel. And I remember my mom being like, well, okay, well, did you get all your shots? And I was like, what? No, I didn't get any shot. I ended up getting like Giardia on that trip. I was sick for 4 months, but it was a life-changing experience. And I remember calling my dad after being there maybe 2 months. And I said, I'm not taking any of those jobs. Like, I'm not going to Russia. My parents were like, we sent you to university for what? And then of course, as the years have gone by, clearly I've been able to make my, living and life be yoga. And yeah, so they accepted it, but they were not happy. They were not happy at all. So, but that was an incredible time to be in Mysore. It was such a small scene. I showed up and I think there were maybe 12 or 13 students there total, and it was in the old studio in Lakshmipuram. And there were 8 people at a time in the studio. So when I look back on that now, it was really precious time. And it was also when like the practice was very strong. There was no mixing, no substituting, no modifications, a lot of injuries, luckily not to me, but yeah. Anyway.
How did you find that early time? I'm always intrigued about different people's opinions of the time with Pattabhi Jois, because it's like everyone knows the stuff around Pattabhi Jois now, blah blah blah. But on the other hand, many people have to say had a really super positive experience with Pattabhi Jois, and many people think that still think of him as guru and guruji and like a healer, like with a magic touch. What was your experience there?
I don't know that I would say he had like a magic touch, but I feel very grateful for the time that I had with him, and I definitely do still think of him as Guruji. I'll never forget when I went there right before we left. Tim had said to me, because he was like, "Do you know the entire primary series?" And I was like, "Well, not really." And I had my little cheat sheet that I had written everything down. He said, "You're not going to be able to use that when you go there." And I remember being like, oh my God, what am I going to do? And literally on the airplane all the way to India, I like memorized the sequence. And everybody had said, you're going to go in on the first day. This is before there were any lead classes. And you're going to start practicing. And at a certain point, they're going to tell you to stop. And then you stop, and that's where you'll end. And the next day you'll come back and, pick it up from there. And you'll get like one pose, whatever it was. And I said, okay. And so also, I had never seen Pattabhi Jois in person. I had only seen the photographs. And I don't know if you're familiar with that very famous Samastitahi photograph of him. It's like a sepia tone.
Yeah.
Anyway, I thought he was a very tall man. I had no idea. So I have his
and
address.
like 20 years old. Yeah,
yeah,
You know,
exactly.
yeah.
Exactly. So I get to the hotel. We're staying at the Hotel Metropole. And I take a rickshaw down to Lakshmipuram, and I get to and it's a house, and I walk up and I'm like, okay. And I knock on the door, and the door opens, and it's Pattabhi Jois, but I don't realize that. And I'm thinking I'm going to look up, and I look down. I was taller than him, and I'm not particularly tall. I'm like 5'5". And I said, I'm looking for Pattabhi Jois. And he said, I'm Pattabhi Jois. And I was like, oh, okay, well, I'm here to practice. He said, yeah, okay, you come in. And I remember we walked in through his house. He had been like doing laundry or something. And we went upstairs. He had this little office upstairs. And I remember he had like this oilcloth on the desk, and he lifted it up, and there was a little key underneath, and he took it out and he unlocked his desk drawer, and he had this enormous ledger book, and he opened it up and he said, you write name, mother's name, something else silly. And, it was like, and I think the cost was like $200 a month plus a $60 registration fee, and he was always very good with the money, man. You never he'd be like, tomorrow you go bank. It's been 1 month. But anyway, I was like, okay. And then he said, so I signed up, and he said, okay, you come tomorrow. And I said, okay, what time? And he said 6 o'clock. And I remember being like, oh God, really 6? Okay, I'll come at 6 o'clock. So the next morning, it was November, and so it was dark in the morning. But there was a few rickshaws that would always hang out outside of the Metropole. So I get in the rickshaw and I go to class, and I go in, and the way the room was set up, it was 2 rows of 4, and we were all facing the same direction. So he pointed, I had a corner spot, and he said, go there. And Sharat had just started assisting him, like within the last year. We're about the same age. I'm like maybe a year older than him. Anyway, so I started practicing, and I was so nervous because, again, I was like, let me remember the sequence, remembering. And I got to around Janu Shirshasana, and all of a sudden I started hearing talking behind me, and it was Sharat, but he wasn't speaking English. He was speaking Kannada, and he was talking to Guruji. And you know how even if you don't know what they're saying, you kind of can get a vibe of what they're saying? And he's responding, and in my head, I'm hearing Sharat say, okay, she's done. She needs to stop. And Pattabhi Jois, no, she's doing fine. She's going to keep going. And he's like, no, she should stop. And Guruji's like, no, you're out. And I just kept going. They let me do the entire primary series on the first day, which I didn't realize was very unusual. So I did the whole primary series, and then the drop backs and the, Viparita Chakrasana and the back bends. I could do all of that. I was 22. So I just turned 22.
That helps.
Yes.
Yeah,
it definitely helps. Supple. I remember Guruji was like, oh, you are very supple. And
and there was only 8 people in the room, because often that people say that later, was there more later in that room, or was it always just 8? A couple
years later it went to 10, and a couple years after that it was 12. And
That's
12 was terrible because it was 5 in the front, 5 in the back, and 2 in the middle. So if you were in the middle, people were kicking you from the front, jumping back, or in the back, jumping through. Those middle spots were terrible. And then, a couple years later, he built the house in Gokulam.
And they never did leg classes in Lakshmipuram, did they? No.
Never.
Oh, that started
I never
in Gokulam.
did one.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
So a lot of people liked getting there for that 4:30 shift because that was the only time that Guruji would say the prayer with everyone. Otherwise, you were on your own. But I was like, I do not need to be here at 4:30 in the morning. That was definitely never, that was never my time. And after about 2 weeks, they started adding the intermediate series. And, honestly, when I started practicing yoga, it was fun. I didn't realize that there was so much more to it. My body could do it. Again, I was young, I was strong, I was flexible. I loved it. But again, I didn't really get the whole mind-body connection. I just hadn't gone that deep. And like a month into being in Mysore, I was getting that deep. And I started kind of feeling like, I don't know if I like this anymore. This isn't fun. Somebody was like, well, it's not just supposed to be fun. And I said, well, I don't really get that. Because I would leave there and some days I would be really elated, happy, things are great. Some days I'd leave there really sad, crying. Some days I'd leave really mad. And I was like, what is like, I just didn't get it. And I remember somebody said to me, you need to read the Yoga Sutras. And I was like, well, what's that? And they were like, the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. I'm like, okay, I don't know what that is, but I want to be a good yogi. Like, do you have a copy? And somebody gave me a book, and it was actually Desikachar's version. And it was a tiny book. It was like the littlest book and super thin. I was like, no problem. Give me that book. And I took it to the hotel. I'll never forget that night. I'm in bed and I start reading it, and like a couple pages in, like I fall asleep, and I was like, oh, I must be tired. And every time I tried to read that book on that trip, I fell asleep. And in my ignorance, I thought, well, it mustn't be a good version of the book, of course. Yeah. And then anyway, I have a whole bunch of stories about that. I ended up going, and when I got back to the States and getting other copies, and I got a really thick one because I thought, well, maybe the thin one wasn't good. And every single one of them put me to sleep. Finally, when I had about 8 Yoga Sutra books next to my bed, I realized that it wasn't the books, that it was me, that I wasn't ready for the sutras. And something that, Guruji really used to kind of speak in sutras when I think back on it now, because one thing he was always famous for saying was, do your practice and all is coming. And I thought, you know what? I'm not really ready for this. I'm going to put these books away and I'm just going to do my practice. And I did for years. And it wasn't until maybe another 5 years down the road when I was asked to do some videos for Gayam, Ashtanga Yoga videos, that then they said, we want to interview you and we want you to talk about philosophy. And I was like, oh, okay, well, let me try to revisit that. But I had enough practice by that point that they actually started to make sense. So that was kind of a cool story. Yeah. And I do have one other story that I really love to share about being in Mysore. One day, so like I told you, I was starting to get more emotional. Things were coming up, and I was actually there with my ex-husband. Well, we were married for over 20 years, Eddie Modestini, and he had been an Iyengar Yoga teacher when I met him. So, and then he was the one who had been teaching Ashtanga Yoga at the school. So we had met. He invited me to come. We ended up getting together on that trip to India, and Pattabhi Jois knew that Eddie was an Iyengar Yoga teacher, and he loved it. So he was always whispering little things to him, like he would whisper in his ear, like the medical benefits of each of the poses, stuff he never said to anyone, because it was like, ooh, I'm going to get this, Iyengar person. And I think because I had shown up with him, although he had been there before, that he sort of maybe thought that I had some Iyengar background. I didn't have any at the time. And I remember, though, because, in Mysore, there wasn't a lot going on. And I practiced at 6 a.m. So I would really try to stretch out my practice. I liked being in the room. There's not a lot of things to do the rest of the day. You hang out at the pool. So literally, I would do like 10 Surya Namaskar A's, 10 Surya Namaskar B's, and then start, the practice. I've always had a really hard time sweating. I'd be wearing sweaters, and I wouldn't really start moving into the standing poses until I could feel some sweat starting. So anyway, one day I was practicing, and this is maybe 2 months into being in Mysore. And if you know anything about the Lakshmi Puram studio, the room was basically part of their house. So on the other side of the wall, there was a door going into their house. The kitchen, there was like a window into the kitchen. And I'm in there practicing in the studio, and I can hear Guruji and Amma talking and maybe arguing or something. And I remember he came walking in and he pushed the door open, and I was in, I think it was like Janu Shirshasana C actually. And he looked at me and he was like, Nicki, why are you so slow? He's like, you Iyengar student. And I remember I was like, oh, like I've just felt my whole body start to vibrate. And I was like, oh, like at the moment, at the time, it felt like such an insult, which is really, again, just me. But I lost it. All of a sudden I couldn't take it. And I could just tell I was about to start crying, like cathartically. And I remember I got up and I grabbed my mat and I ran upstairs, because we used to do finishing poses upstairs because there wasn't enough room. So I'd go upstairs, unless you were in the last group. And I remember I got in Paschimottanasana and I was sobbing. Like, it was loud too. And, it was not a big house. So I'm sure everybody could hear me. And, somebody came up to me and they were like, "Oh, he didn't mean that." I'm like, "Yes, he did. He's so mean. I'm not an Iyengar student." And anyway, and then, so I'm like catharting in Paschimottanasana. And then Eddie came up and he said, Guruji wants you to go downstairs and talk to him. And I was like, "I'm not going down there." But of course I knew the only way out of the house was to go down the stairs and out the door. I was like, so, it took me about 20 minutes to kind of gather myself. My face is all puffy. And finally I roll up my mat and I'm like, "Oh God." And then I go to leave and I'm standing at the top of the stairs, starting to walk down, and Guruji's standing at the bottom of the stairs. And I took a couple steps towards him and he said, "Nicki, why crying?" And I said, "Oh, you were so mean to me. You called me an Iyengar student." And he said, "Nicki, you're crying, I'm crying. You're smiling, I'm smiling." And I, of course, started crying more. And then he said, "Come." And I walked down the stairs and he said, "Come here." And we went into the room. And he used to have this stool that he would sit on in the corner. And he said, pointed to the floor and he said, "You sit." And I sat on the floor and he sat on the stool and he put his hand on my head. And that was it. There was some kind of Shaktipat that I got. And that was it. I was like, this is my teacher. And every day for the next 2 months, because I stayed for 4 months on that first trip, I would finish my practice and go downstairs and I would just sit for as long as I could. And he would just occasionally come by and put his hand on my head. And that's why I kept going back to Mysore. Because it wasn't, I actually left Mysore and my back hurt. And I ended up finding an Iyengar Yoga teacher that Eddie knew. And she took one look at me and she was like, "Well, no wonder your back hurts. You're only bending in your lumbar spine." And I was like, "Well, what does that mean?" So she taught me a lot about how to use my whole spine. And thank God I never had back pain again. But the feeling, the energy. So I didn't go back for the poses or the technique or any of that, although I did finish third series with him. I went back for that love. Like, it was really, and it was like he was my grandfather. It really was very, it was like a really, pure thing. I did have to set my boundaries with him. But it was a really, I've never found that in a teacher since. So, but it was an incredible experience, actually.
I don't remember you in the time that I was there, so I assume you just stopped going when Pattabhi Jois passed away. Is that right?
Yes. Honestly, when Pattabhi, I was there for the funeral, and we were actually trying to get there. We knew he was sick, and we had kind of planned an emergency trip. And literally the morning of the day that we were heading to the airport to leave the States, he passed away. We found out, and we went anyway. And I'll never forget, like, we didn't even stop at the hotel. We went straight to the house in Gokulam, and Saraswati was like, "You said you were coming. He knew you were coming and he was asking for you. Like, where have you been?" And I said, "Well, we were in the States. It takes 2 days to get here. Like, we were trying to get here. We ended up, it was kind of cool because when we got there, nobody was there, because he had been ill and nobody was really there. And so we ended up staying for a few weeks. So we got like some really special time with, Saraswati and Sharad and the family before like all the students started showing up. And to be honest with you, by that point, which was like 2009, I think it was, right? I, was also practicing a lot of Iyengar Yoga. I'd been to Pune to study with the Iyengars. I love Sharad. I was in India in February and I went and visited him in Mysore. Like, he feels like family to me. They are family to me. But when Guruji died, for me, it was kind of a liberating thing, because as much as I loved Guruji and I love Ashtanga Yoga, it informs everything I teach, I'm not really dogmatic about it. I teach, in fact, the name of my studio is the Maui Yoga Studio. So really what I call the yoga that I teach now, I call it Maui Yoga because it means illusion and you never know what it's going to be. And I prefer to teach the people that are in front of me. I don't,
Right.
every once in a
Yeah.
while, like I'll bang out, the series, but
How does that transpire then? What do you teach if someone comes to your class? I mean, like, how
like,
would
for
they expect to be
example,
taught? Yeah.
yeah, well, I like to say that, I draw from both of those backgrounds, and I like to really say that I teach in the lineage of Krishnamacharya because, of course, he was the teacher of both of those students, right? And Indra Devi and Desikachar. So for me, it's really important to teach who's in front of me. So my studio has all the Iyengar Yoga props, right? Because I like to use the props, because really the original intention of the props is to give you access to the action of a pose. It's not to make the pose easier. If you know anything about who Mr. Iyengar was, it's definitely was not about making anything easier. So, for example, like in the last few years, because of all, the COVID and all the stress response and nervous system agitation, I start people laying down, and we do, I'll call it, say, we'll take like 2 blocks and put the mentan and a blanket under your head. You put the block under your upper chest and you get still. So it's about opening your upper chest to facilitate deeper breathing and to support your parasympathetic nervous system, which only happens when your body is totally still. And then we'll sit up and we'll do some chanting. I really love the chanting. So we do various mantras, we do Yoga Sutras, and then we do some Vajrasanas, some footwork, we do some focused downward dog, and then we usually move into Surya Namaskar A and B. We do a lot of those. I also teach a lot of lunge work because people are very stiff in their front body from all the sitting and things that we do. And then it kind of depends on the day and the energy of the people. Some days I focus on back bend. Some days I focus on, forward bend. Some days, and always there's standing poses. And a lot of the time I do the Ashtanga sequence of the standing poses. In fact, the way that my yoga evolved was from Ashtanga Yoga here on Maui, because we were teaching here. We started teaching in 1998. That's when my daughter's name is Maya. My oldest daughter's name is Maya. She'll be 25 this year. And we didn't have a name for the studio. And then after she was born, I thought, well, that's a good name. And we were teaching Ashtanga Yoga because here, like I said, on Maui, there's been Ashtanga Yoga for a very long time. Unfortunately, a lot of those people practicing in the kind of older ways with very little awareness of alignment, they hurt themselves and then they stop practicing yoga, which is really sad. So I used to call them the Ashtanga Yoga casualties, and they started hearing about our studio, which is in the middle of nowhere. I mean, we really are like in the middle of nowhere. It's on the North Shore in the jungle. It was like a 10-minute drive down a dirt road. But people started here because Eddie had been an Iyengar yoga teacher. So he's really like a yoga therapist. So people were like, started telling other people, you can go and you're not going to get hurt. So people started coming, and it was nice because Eddie and I taught together for years. So I would keep the rhythm of the class moving, like led classes, and he would sort of go around and be like the yoga whisperer and like helping people individually. So it was almost like a lead and a Mysore class together, which was cool. And so we were teaching the series like 6 days a week, and then we started to, one of the days of the week, we were teaching a bit like Tim Miller used to teach. He used to teach a class on Thursdays, and he would call it like Guru Day or Surya Namaskar C. Have you ever heard of that?
Yeah, I have. Yeah.
Where he would, start to link the standing poses. So we started doing that. And then, so it went from like 6 days a week of real traditional to 5 days and 1 day a little bit different to 4 days and 2 days a little bit different. And what we started to do was teach Surya Namaskar A and B, like 10 of each. And then we would do all the standing poses twice. And then we would focus often on back bends and the inversions, right? All the, the headstand, shoulder stand, those sequences. So, so it was really kind of organic over years. And like I said, honestly, when Pattabhi Jois passed away, for me, it was kind of liberating because I know a lot of people just shifted to Sharat, and I love Sharat dearly, but he was never my teacher. And so I remember feeling sad for a number of years, like, oh, I miss having a teacher, right? There's something very sacred about that dynamic and that relationship. And, I would go and I would see when Chirac comes to the States, I'll go take classes with him. Like, I love him and I love his family, his wife, his kids. I mean, I've known them for a very long time. However, the whole scene, I didn't, for me, I couldn't just shift from Pattabhi Jois to Chirac. I was like, okay, well, now I'm, kind of on my own. But
I think there's a lot of people that feel similarly. And I think, if you're kind of in that time period, it's pretty understandable as well. But what about other teachers there? As you walked into a scene that was established in Maui, and I always wondered how much interaction there was between, say, Nancy, or I imagine David Williams is probably always a bit out there, but maybe you might have had interaction with Nancy or Danny Paradise, or is there any kind of sense of community?
Oh, I love Danny. He never lived on Maui, and he's always been a real traveling teacher. I mean, he's home sometimes. Nancy, though, actually, we started coming. The first time I came to Maui was in 1992 because we met some people on that first trip in 91 who were from Maui, and they said, oh, why don't you come visit us? And so who's going to turn down a free place to stay on Maui? So the next summer we came, and we would go and we practiced at Nancy's studio. And you know how the Ashtanga scene at least was. I don't know if it's still like that, but teachers were always leaving to go to Mysore to go teach, and they would always need somebody to sub, right? So we started doing that a little bit with Nancy. We would come and teach a workshop, or we would sub, and so that was the introduction to Maui. But like David Williams, he wasn't really publicly teaching. He would teach at his house, but he lived in Hana, which was like a 2-hour drive. So that was that. And I know David Swenson would come and go, but now he has a house here. But back then he didn't. So yeah, there really wasn't. There weren't a lot. Nancy, had the main scene, and that happened to be on the North Shore, which was rather convenient. And then we ended up buying property here in '95 and built a yoga studio. And we live 100%. Well, I live off the grid, so solar electricity. We have a well. We have, it's totally off grid. We actually got good internet right at the beginning of COVID, which was great. Lucky. They put in fiber optic cables. It was unbelievable. I had, everybody had to pivot and teach online. So I had been in India and I came back to a pandemic and the best internet I had ever had. So kind of interesting.
And a particular reason for getting you on the podcast, I wanted you to come on anyway, but today, obviously, in the light of the recent disaster in Maui, I know you've been helping out there and doing some stuff to help out after the fires. Do you want to speak a little bit about that and what's going on for people?
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about what's happening on Maui. So it was 2 weeks ago. Tomorrow was the 8th of August. We had horrific wildfires come through. There was a hurricane that was on its way here, so it was sending incredibly strong winds in the 60 to 80 to 90 mile an hour range. And, I live on the North Shore, which is the wet side. Lahaina, which is the town that was burned to the ground, is on the west side. And it's after years and years of plantations and colonizations and things like that, it's a tinderbox. Like, it's very, very dry. Water's been diverted. I mean, there's so many things that are wrong about the development that happened on the west side. And so it was unfortunately kind of like a perfect storm situation. And the wind knocked down power lines, which then sparked a fire. And early in the day, the fire actually was contained by about 1 p.m. They said that the fire was contained, and we were all like, okay. And then at about 4:30 in the afternoon, it started up again. And the wind, like 80, 90 miles an hour. I mean, the fire was moving a mile a minute. And the old town of Lahaina, literally, Lahaina was the original capital of the Kingdom of Hawaii. It was also the whaling capital of the Pacific. And so the buildings are really old, and wood. So it was like the old town was really, it was like a tinderbox. And I mean, it's so crazy. The entire town burned in like less than 3 hours. Devastating. So over 2,000 homes and structures were burned. Right now they've identified 115 people who have died. There's almost 1,000 or about 1,000 missing. People are literally, I mean, these souls have been burnt, to the like ash. It's devastating. So people had to leave. So it's been, yeah, it's unbelievable, the displacement of all these people, and so many of these people that were living in Lahaina town were old Hawaiian families, multi-generational families living on properties, a lot of immigrants, there's a lot of Micronesians, a lot of Mexicans, a lot of Filipino families, and they're not wealthy people. It's ironic that of course, what burned the most was people that really did not have anything to lose, and they lost their homes, their jobs, their livelihoods. So for the last 2 weeks, I've been, volunteering at shelters, preparing meals, and I actually taught a online yoga class yesterday that I was so blown away by. I raised $7,000 yesterday for the cause, and the amount of money and the outpouring that has been coming into Maui. We are so grateful and just blown away. I mean, most of the world has a soft spot for Hawaii in their hearts, and it's really made me feel good about humanity again, because sometimes it's easy to feel down about humans and what we've done. But to see the community rally, also Maui, we're isolated. It's in the middle of the Pacific. Even though there's a huge military base on Oahu that is not far away, they didn't show up for days. It was the community that came together, and to see the outpouring of people showing up with donations, food, clothing, medical stuff, bedding. I mean, it really is unbelievable. And I was the other day, on Friday, I was volunteering in Lahaina at a distribution hub, and there were some people from Red Cross and FEMA, which is the Federal Emergency Management Organization, and they were telling us that they've never come to a disaster zone and seen a community already so mobilized and taking care of their own, that they were blown away. They're like, usually we come in and it's a clean slate, like we do everything. And we've been blown away by how much the community rallied. And, in Hawaii, family is a really important part of culture, right? And the Hawaiian word for family is ohana. So to really see people come together has been nothing short of awe-inspiring. It's been amazing.
It seems to have always been a hotbed of yoga as well. Do you want to just briefly speak about the specialness of Hawaii? What is it that is so special there, that's attracted so many people, with spiritual leanings, say?
Yeah, I mean, the original Hawaiian people were incredibly spiritual people, very, very in their hearts. They're very, it's a spiritual culture. It's a very important part, and to be connected to the land. And for me, like when I look out the window here, living on the North Shore, it reminds me of India. It does. It's the jungle. It reminds me of being in South India. So for me, it always had that feeling, and the heat, the warmth, has always attracted people. And honestly, again, a lot of the original yogis back in the day, they were hippies, right? And a lot of people sort of left the mainland to get away from, the squares or whatever people, and came to Hawaii looking for a different way of life, and really kind of forged it. And yoga, I don't know, it seems to go hand in hand. There's a lot of spirituality here. There's something about the energy in this place that really contributes to practice and to, I don't know, to opening your mind. And it's also an interesting place. Like, you have to be respectful of this culture, of this land. If Hawaii doesn't like you, you're out. it really feels that way. So I feel so blessed. My studio is on my property, and I'm always offering prayers and gratitude for being welcome to the island. Both my children were born here. And I feel so proud that this is my home. And I feel like I've been welcomed, really. Yeah.
Well, to end that subject, so there'll be links to donations below. If anyone wants to donate, that would be great.
Please.
Yeah, I think, everyone is thinking of you right now. And just to finish off the podcast, Nicki, on a brighter note, I always say, give me one guilty pleasure and one inspiration. So a guilty pleasure and inspiration.
A guilty
can be anything.
pleasure.
Yeah, just don't say chocolate.
No, I wouldn't say chocolate. What's a guilty pleasure? Well,
coffee.
definitely...
You can't say coffee. That's off.
Yeah,
that's
no,
off
coffee
now.
is like it's a religion. No, it's not coffee. A guilty pleasure, honestly, is that I still go to a lot of concerts. I saw 7 Dead shows this summer.
They're still playing.
Can you believe that? There's like a couple of the original members, and I actually was on the mainland seeing them in San Francisco and LA and Washington State. So I still get out there, and I still love going to concerts and seeing music. Yeah. And inspiration, just be your most authentic self. It's so hard to be anything but to have to wear too many hats. So I think the older I get, I realize that how important it is really to be yourself. And, not everybody's going to love you, but at least you'll be loving yourself, right? You gotta be authentic. I think it goes a really long way.
That's a great one as well. Well, it's been a pleasure, Nicki. Very nice and flowing conversation. And let's hope we can raise some money for you there.
Oh my God, we'd be so grateful.
Yeah. Right. So, thanks again for coming on. And it's been a long time in the offing, but I've really enjoyed our time. So thanks,
Me
Nicki.
too. Thank you. Thank you.